are recording this. So from this point forward, it's going to be recorded, okay? And probably we'll be able to post this to our YouTube channel. If anybody missed a portion of it, you can come back and watch that. Though, yeah, I'll just be honest with you. If you spend much time watching things like this on YouTube, man, you may have as an exciting life as we do sometimes here at the Extension office. But anyway, appreciate you being here now. But as I was saying, folks will ask, they'll show pictures and they'll describe this kind of damage and want to know a couple of things. Number one, what's caused it? And number two, what can we do about it to help minimize it, to help make sure that we don't have future damage, and several things like that. We don't have a wildlife biologist on staff here at the Extension office. And unless we actually see the creature that causes the damage, a lot of times, no, not a lot of times, most of the time, we're making a somewhat educated guess or speculation as to what it is that's causing the damage. Now, we can have a pretty good idea just based on the symptom, the kind of damage that occurs, but unless we actually see it, we may not always know for sure. And there's the last one, I think, the kind of typical damage that folks see when they say that things are tearing up the yard. Sometimes it may be easier to tell you what it's not causing this damage versus what it is causing this damage. Now, I feel fairly confident that there are 2 or 3 things that are not causing any kind of damage in your lawn. They're not tearing the yard up in any way. I don't think we have to worry about Bigfoot being responsible for causing damage out in the lawn. You don't have to worry about snakes digging holes in your yard. And folks will say, well, I think I have snake holes in my yard. Snakes don't dig holes. Snakes will live in holes, and they will utilize holes that other creatures have dug. They may utilize existing burrow spaces. But snakes just don't have the appendages necessary to dig a hole. Now, some can kind of bury themselves in loose soil, under litter, etc., things like that. But as far as physically digging a hole, they don't have paws, they don't have legs, and I've never seen a snake with a shovel. So the snakes are not causing holes in your yard. There may be snakes in holes in your yard, but the snake did not cause that hole. So we're pretty sure that the snake didn't cause that hole, that they didn't tear the yard up. And I'm pretty sure it's not lawn zombies that are causing the damage that you might find out in the yard. So we can rule those things out. Okay, just right off the bat. We can rule those out. We're pretty sure that they ain't the problem. But what are the problems? Typically, we're going to see the 2 most common repeat offenders. These are the ones that are responsible for the majority of the damage that folks call the Extension office asking questions about, or we make visits out to home sites, to look at things and to consult with folks about issues. And typically, these are the 2 right here. These are our most common repeat offenders. First one is the mole, in this case, the eastern mole or the gray mole. And the second one is a vole. Those are the 2 that are responsible for the bulk of the damage that we see when you've got damage done to landscapes, done to lawns, etc. Now, there are some other suspects that can cause this kind of damage. And so a few of those include things just like the common average everyday striped skunk. And we certainly don't have a shortage of those. Armadillos, we have been blessed to have populations of armadillos migrate here into the middle part of Tennessee. And they came in kind of from the western side, I guess from the southwestern side, and have moved, north and east across the state. And they're pretty well established here in Middle Tennessee at this time, and have started to gain more of a foothold in the eastern part of the state. So we've got armadillos out here sometimes. Some folks are fortunate enough to have crawfish in their lawns and their landscapes. It can cause some damage, and you'll see disrupted soil and mounds of earth and so on created out there. And raccoons also can cause damage or tear up places out in the yard. So we're going to talk about some of these things this evening. Okay, but first let's think about the eastern mole, because that is probably the most common one that when folks report damage and they describe the kind of damage, or we make a visit and see, then it's pretty darn easy to tell that it was a mole that's responsible for causing that damage. Now, in the state of Tennessee, there are 3 moles, but the one that we have here in our part of the state is this one called the eastern mole, or the gray mole, up in the northeastern parts of the state. There's also in some areas something called a short tail mole, and there's also one called a star-nosed mole. but we just don't have them down here in the middle part of the state. So if you have damage caused by a mole, it was this fella right here or some of his kin folks that were causing that damage. And, you know, these things aren't really big. Now, eastern moles throughout the southeastern United States, as well into the northern areas of the United States as well. But all across the state, you're going to find these guys, and they're not a really large animal. They can be anywhere from 5.5 to 8 inches long, and they're not super heavy. They're not a real dense animal. You know, 1 to 5 ounces is going to be a typical size as far as weight is concerned, but they can certainly cause a fair amount of damage, simply because of the characteristics, the way these things are put together. So just a little bit about moles. First of all, moles are mammals, and they are insectivores. They eat insects. Okay, they are not rodents. They don't chew things. They don't gnaw things. They don't have the tooth structure. They don't have the jaw structure that say a vole or a squirrel or a rat, something like that, a rodent. They don't have the ability to chew and to gnaw on things. The way moles are made, their body is somewhat streamlined. They have ears, they have eyes. The ears are pretty well hidden. You know, they're not noticeable. They don't stick out away from the body. And the interesting thing about moles is the way their fur is attached. It's attached in such a way that it can move in any direction, so that the mole can move forward in a tunnel, it can move backwards in a tunnel, it can move vertically, horizontally. And the fact that that hair moves any direction helps cut down on friction. So it makes their lives a little bit easier as they navigate underground. I mean, they are fossorial. They spend their lives underground. Very seldom are moles going to come up on top of the ground. They do have eyes, little bitty eyes that in moles, you know, you've seen cartoons, I guess, where moles are depicted to have poor eyesight. That's probably a pretty accurate description. Now, those little eyes are able to distinguish light from dark. And how did folks figure that out? You know, I can only speculate. But the experts tell us that moles can distinguish light from dark, but as far as identifying specific objects and shapes, etc., probably they can't do that. They've got big front feet, and they are attached to the body in such a way they kind of point out, and they move in somewhat of a paddling or a swimming motion through the earth. And that might be a good way to describe the way they move, is they swim through the soil. Now, the way these things are made, and their musculature and the way the forelimbs, their front paws, their legs and feet are attached, it allows them to exert 32 times their body weight. Now, think about that just a minute. You know, 32 times their body weight. So if we were to put that into human terms, that a mole that can exert enough force to move a mass 32 times its body weight would be somewhat like a 150-pound person moving 4,800 pounds. So that's kind of impressive. You know, these guys work pretty hard for what they do, because they do spend their lives underground in a lower oxygen environment. The hemoglobin in their blood is described as being superhemoglobin, and it allows them to process carbon dioxide more efficiently, which allows them to breathe underground because they're exhaling. You know, they are a mammal. They take in oxygen, they exhale carbon dioxide, and so the hemoglobin in their blood, but the way it's put together, allows them to process that carbon dioxide more efficiently. But because their blood, the hemoglobin in the blood is referred to as superhemoglobin, it may influence the efficacy of some toxicants in how efficient those are, or how much efficacy those toxicants have at controlling moles. You know, for example, something that might do a good job of controlling, say, a mouse or a rat might not be as effective against a mole, simply because of the way their blood is made up. A little bit about moles in general. You know, they are mammals. They do mate typically late wintertime, early spring is their mating season. So here in Middle Tennessee, that's probably going to be somewhere in the late February to the early part of April. And the females are going to gestate for 4 to 6 weeks. So, you know, a month to 6 weeks is how long it takes for their litters to be born. And the babies are called pups. They're referred to as pups. And usually they're going to have anywhere from 2 to 6 of these little baby moles or these pups in a litter. They're born, you know, they're bald, they're hairless, they're helpless. But after about a month, though, they have developed enough that they can leave the nest and they can go out into the world and start doing whatever moles do. A female is going to have about 1 litter per year. And, moles can be relatively long-lived. Adult moles can, probably an average of about 3 years. Been some studies done where, based on some tracking devices and whatnot, that they have found females here in the Southeast that could, live up to 6 years. But, relatively a long-lived little creature. Now, what do moles eat? Okay, what do they eat? Well, as I said, they're insectivores. They don't eat plant parts, but they eat a variety of different insect species that they come into contact with as they tunnel through the earth. You're not going to find moles that are eating plant parts. If you find plants that are damaged and they show evidence of feeding damage, you can pretty well rest assured that a mole didn't do that. About the only time they would take in any plant material might be to help line, say, a birthing chamber, an underground birthing chamber or a resting chamber, kind of a permanent structure as part of their tunnel network below the ground. But they're not going to come up, they're not going to feed on vegetables, they're not going to feed on ornamental plant roots, etc., things like that, but just a lot of different invertebrates. The eastern mole's diet, but in folks that study these things, boy, bless them. The fact that they'll have enough interest and get into it and look and research this and cut these things open and find out what to eat. But they have identified 52 different foods that are common in an eastern mole's diet. And these include things like white grubs. The white grubs are they're the larval stage of beetles. Okay, many different scarab beetles that as they go through their metamorphosis, they go through that grub stage. And they turn into June bugs and the Japanese beetles and the mass Schaefer beetles and the May beetles and June beetles, etc., things like that. They eat earthworms, ants, centipedes, cicadas, the grubs or the immature forms of periodical cicadas or annual cicadas. Boy, there was some moles in Arkansas, folks doing some research out there, and they studied the stomach contents and found 29 different species of ants in some of these mole stomachs. But just lots of snails, things like that. That's kind of what they're focusing on. That's their food source. But apparently, earthworms are their number one most favorite food. When given a choice, again, folks study this stuff and they have determined this to be, pretty true. I think that if given the choice, they will very often choose earthworms, night crawlers, things like that, over some other food sources. But they do have a lot of different options, and they're not super picky, but when given the choice, they really do like to eat earthworms. Now, how much does a mole eat? What does it take to keep one going? Well, moles don't hibernate. They don't have down times throughout the course of the year. So because of that, they have to feed year round. So a lot of different sources estimate that a mole can eat anywhere from 70 to 80% of their body weight daily. Of course, you're not talking about a huge animal in the first place, maybe anywhere from an ounce to 8 ounces, something like that, or 5 ounces, maybe, not 8 ounces. But, and again, there's going to be some variations there, but that still can add up to a significant amount of insect intake in the course of a day, and think about over the course of a year. It's estimated that a 5-ounce mole can potentially consume anywhere from 45 to 50 pounds of invertebrates, worms, insects, etc., in the course of a year's time. So that's a fairly substantial intake. Now, very often folks will say that, man, I must have a bunch of moles in my yard, or I have a lot of moles in the garden. Moles are not real big. They don't run in packs. They don't have gangs. You're not going to have to worry about a mole gang knocking on the door some night and say, hey, buddy, you're kind of intruding here on our territory. This is our turf. You're going to have to leave. That's not going to happen because they don't hang out in gangs. They're not gregarious. They don't have herds, populations, groups of them together. For the most part, they're pretty solitary animals, with the exception being, during reproduction, the males and the females have got to get together in order for that to happen. And also during the early stages of young rearing, until those young moles get to the point that they can go off on their own. You're very seldom are they going to come to the surface. Now, yes, there are, folks will find a mole on the surface of the ground sometimes, or possibly, a dog or a cat will bring one to you, but you don't typically find moles on top of the ground. They spend most of their time below the surface. If they do come to the surface, it might be that they're foraging around there for some nesting materials, some grass, etc., to carry back down into a more permanent nesting chamber, resting chamber that they have built down part of their tunnel network below ground. And sometimes they can move a little faster on top of the ground versus under the soil. And if they're looking for some new feeding territory, they might occasionally move on the surface, but it's not going to happen much. And there's lots of folks, they can live long and fruitful lives and never see a mole. All right, they can certainly see the evidence that the mole has been there, but they're not going to see the mole in person. They're pretty much active all year long. Now, typically, there is more evidence of surface activity in the spring and the fall months. But you know what? I found that sometimes these moles don't read the right books, and they don't understand that, and they may be just as active. Some populations just as active in the summer as they're supposed to be in the spring of the year. And why they won't read the books and know how they're supposed to act. Who knows what goes through a mole's mind. And very common, it's very common for their peak activity to be during the earlier morning hours. But again, sometimes there'll be periods in the evening when there may be increased activity. And again, I'm going to blame it on the fact that the moles are not reading the references that they ought to. So they don't necessarily know how to act. Don't blame them. They're just moles. They're doing the best they can. I mentioned that folks will say, man, I must have a yard full of moles. Well, the size of the territory, I guess, that a mole population will occupy is dependent on a couple of things, just like the population of any wildlife species. How much food is there out there? That's going to influence and dictate how many members of a population that piece of ground will support, and also the gender. Is it a male versus a female? That can have an influence on how much or how big a mole's territory is as well. Generally speaking, an acre will support 2 to 3 moles at a time. These are based on tracking studies done over time, where they'll capture moles and put tracking devices on them and monitor them for extended periods of time. But generally speaking, an acre will support 2 to 3 different moles. On a really good site where there's excellent food availability, it can be in that 3 to 5 range. But 3 to 5 moles spread out over an acre, boy, a lot of folks are going to think in their suburban lawn that they may have 4 or 5 or 6 moles out there working in a 10,000 square foot yard, and chances are really good they don't. That they don't. Back in the late 70s, a tracking study found that males, their home range covered just a little under 3 acres, somewhere about 2.7 acres, and females, a good bit less than that, somewhere in the neighborhood of a little under a full acre, 7/10 of an acre. Male ranges typically don't overlap except during the mating season, and they will become more active and they'll branch over into one another's territory during the mating season. Females are not quite as particular about that, apparently, and they will overlap ranges a little bit. But you're not going to find gangs of moles out there working together, to destroy your landscape. Typically, it's going to be an arbitrary or just a single mole doing that. So the thing that tells us that moles are active is their tunneling behavior. And that's something that anybody that's ever had, their own home, they've had a lawn for any period of time or a landscape, chances are really good that you have seen the effects of mole tunneling out there. And they create, some different kinds of tunnels. Here we've got the more extended raised surface tunnel. You don't particularly have holes in the ground per se, but that soil has been pushed up, and now you've got a raised ridge. And very often, or most often, it is not in a straight line. It tends to zigzag and waver. About the only time you'd find it running in a straight line is if it's running along beside something, belongs alongside, say, some structure like a fence or a driveway, something like that. And you can see areas where the grass in a yard, in a turf grass setting, may be brown because the mole has damaged the grass. Well, folks see this, say, well, that mole is killing the grass. Technically, yes, the mole's activity did cause that grass to turn brown, but not because the mole ate the grass or not because the mole, fed on the grass roots, but it's because the mole pushed that area up, and now those grass roots are no longer in contact with the soil, as they were before. And because they're not in contact with the soil, then the roots are not able to pull nutrients, not able to pull moisture out of the soil. And so you can have damage to the plants. But it's not because of their feeding, it's just because of their normal tunneling behavior. And they can't help it. I mean, that's what they were born to do. They got to do that. And then we have the mole hills. Okay. You know, the old saying, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. Well, that's what a molehill is. Okay. It's a mound of soil. Moles you don't see openings into their tunnels. You don't have exit holes or entrance holes typically visible on the surface because they spend the bulk of their time underground. Like I said, there's a lot of folks can live a good, long, and productive life without ever seeing a mole on top of the ground anywhere. And you're not typically going to find an opening or a hole in a mole hill or somewhere along a surface tunnel. That's just not going to happen. Okay, why do we have these mole hills up there? Well, it is we'll look at a diagram in just a minute. That may help make a little more sense out of it. But when it comes to moles, and they're good tunnelers, they're very efficient tunnelers. They can dig these surface tunnels, the one that you see where the soil is raised up above the surface of the ground, some in the neighborhood of 15 to 18 feet per hour. So that's a pretty hard working little critter right there. Now, they can move relatively fast through an existing tunnel, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 feet per minute. A single mole, an eastern gray mole, it's estimated that they can, on a good day, dig nearly 100 feet of tunnel in a single day's time. And that's why in a home lawn, in a suburban lawn, and it's something in the 10,000, 15,000 square foot range, 100 feet of tunnel a day can cover a lot of ground. And it can seem that, my gosh, I must have a whole herd of these moles down there. When in reality, probably not. You just got one very active mole in there, or maybe two very active moles in a case. But typically, you're not going to find them together. Now, the longest single tunnel that's ever been measured on record, it was over 3,000 feet long, and it followed along a fence row, a long fence. You think about that, 3,000 feet, that's over half a mile. A single run, a single surface tunnel like that. Tunneling is hard work. They typically are going to take the path of least resistance. So you may see moles that tunnel along sidewalks or along driveways, maybe newly built fences and so on, simply because the soil in those areas, especially if it's a relatively new construction, may be softer, looser there. It's just easier for them to run through and to dig through there because that ground is not as hard and compacted as on an older site might be. Mole tunneling, can be progressive. Like I said earlier, that females can average, 3 years or so of life expectancy, and if she is in a particular landscape, for 3 years, she may have a very extensive tunnel network built over time. And they're going to start off, they're not going to build all the tunnel in a single year, but the longer they're there, the more tunnel they're going to build. So that network can become more extensive over time as they spend time there, moving about through the lawn, through the landscape, trying to find enough of these insects and whatnot in order to keep them going. The size of a disturbed area is not going to correlate to a given number of moles. Now, why will there be an increase of damage that you see on the surface? Well, typically when we've got good moist soil conditions, like in the early springtime or the latter part of the summer into the fall time frame, when you have maybe a little more regular rainfall, some of these insect populations that are in the ground may be closer to the surface of the ground. And so a mole does not have to go as deep to find those. And so if their food source isn't very deep, they don't have to tunnel very deeply, and they're going to find a bulk of their food by utilizing surface tunnels. So you may see more surface damage because the food source is closer to the top of the ground in the first place. They don't have to go deep to find more food. But conversely, if food sources get to be in short supply, it could be the mole is just out there looking, and they're trying to cover lots of ground in a relatively short time just to find something to eat. So it's kind of an inverse thing. It can be increased surface damage just because there's a good food supply out there, or There may be increased surface damage when food supplies are not as plentiful. You know, sometimes during the course of the summer, you'll see a decrease in mold activity. Soil moistures go down, and insect populations may go deeper into the soil, following the moisture, and the molds may go deeper there, you know, to find them because they are deeper. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, when molds damage plants, it's just a result of them physically damaging the roots because of their, you know, tunneling action, not because they're eating the plant. So it's not because of mold feeding. You know, generally two types of tunnels that molds are going to create. You've got the surface type. We've already mentioned probably the reasons you see those. During the mating season, males are going to go out in search of a female. And so you may see more surface damage, more surface tunnels, pushed up tunnels, because he's out there trying to find a date. Also, when the moles are expanding territory, they've been in an area for a while, they need to move out into that yard, okay, to take in some more ground. So you may see some more surface activity there, simply because digging closer to the surface is going to be easier for them than digging down deeper. And, you know, they're creating feeding tunnels when food supplies are close to the surface of the ground. And those can be temporary because, you know, maybe there's the food supply, maybe food is in short supply. And so they try a tunnel. Well, there's not much here. I'm going to abandon it. I'm going to go off in this direction and try to find a better concentration of worms and insects and so on. So those are the reasons you see these pushed up tunnels like that. And then the second kind are the deeper, the more permanent tunnels. When you see a mole hill, a mound of soil pushed up out of the ground, you know, something below ground pushed it up. We just don't have that many critters that dig underneath the soil here. And generally, you can just pretty much always count on it being a mole that's done that. But why do they create these hills, these mounds like that? It's because they're digging deeper. And that dirt has got to go somewhere. So as they're digging these deeper tunnels, they will move this soil from deeper in the ground up to the surface and push some of this up to get it out of the way. All right. Now, why would they do that? Why do they dig deeper tunnels, more permanent tunnels? Well, maybe to connect regularly used feeding areas. You know, it could be they figured out that, boy, around this, around this maple tree over here, man, there's a lot of cicadas down there feeding on those roots. And so that's a great feeding area. So we'll come over here and feed for a while, but you know, I don't know how sensitive a mole's palate is, but maybe they want to change. And this area over here has got good moisture and there's a good earthworm population. So they may move from where there's a good supply of cicada nymphs in the ground over here to this other area where there's a good supply of earthworms in the soil. So they may use some of these deeper tunnels that don't get damaged by our activity interfering with their environment, by mowing across them, instead of doing things like that on the surface of the ground. And they may have those deeper tunnels, permanent tunnels, to connect those two. They can also have, you know, deeper feeding tunnels that they use on a regular basis when the soil moisture gets to be not so plentiful and the insects move deeper into the ground. They've got those feeding tunnels down there that they're going to utilize to take advantage of those insects that are deeper in the ground. And then, you know, they have to have a nest somewhere where to birth these babies and places to rest occasionally. So that's the reason they may have these deeper, more permanent type tunnels. Here's an illustration. Is that an accurate depiction? You know what? I'm going to assume that it is. I don't know how many folks have gone underground and followed these mold tunnels around, but based on the excavations and whatnot, here's what they've come up with, that you'll have your surface tunnels, and then you've got these main tunnels that are run deeper into the ground that we don't really see the results of those, except for when we see the mounds pushed up on the surface of the ground where they have excavated that dirt out of these deeper channels, out of these deeper tunnels, to get it up out of their way, allow them to keep expanding their tunnel network. So that's that's kind of why we see the different kinds of tunnels, the reason they make the different tunnels. Now why do moles like suburban lawns so well? Well, many folks take pride in their lawn, and they will fertilize the turf grass out there, or they will fertilize the landscape plants, and they will irrigate those areas in times of, you know, reduced rainfall. Well, so if there's good nutrient availability in the soil, which supports a lot of plant growth, And if there's good moisture that supports plant growth, then there's going to be a more biomass, okay, more roots, more shoots, more stems, etc. And a lot of these insects are feeding on that stuff, okay, on that biomass that that the lawn and the landscape produces. So the more biomass is there, then the greater food population, because those areas that have more biomass can support more worms, they can support more grubs, they can support more ants, etc. And so, you know, it's a good place. You know, a home lawn is a good place for moles because it creates a good environment with a very often a better, a more consistent food source versus trying to go out here and scavenge around in, say, a neglected area where nothing's going on there. Nothing's been done for a long time, just kind of grown up some. And, you know, a home in the home lot, they've got lots of borders, whether it's along sidewalks, whether it's along foundations, whether it's along driveway edges, along fences, etc. And that may make a more favorable area for tunneling because that ground's been disturbed and it's maybe easier to tunnel through. So those are some reasons that you tend to see moles in your home yard. Okay. Now we've talked about, you know, all the damage that moles cause, but, you know, let's give the devil his due here just a little bit. All right. You know, I guess there's, you know, most things aren't truly evil. There's always, or typically, there's some positive. And think about what this mole does. So the fact of these moles moving underneath the ground like that, you know, they're creating aeration channels. So they may improve oxygen content down in that upper soil surface in the top 6, 8, 12 inches of soil down there. And the better, you know, plants need oxygen in the root zone in order for them to survive and to grow. Well, so if they have improved aeration, then aeration means that they've introduced more oxygen. So that may be a plus. They may, you know, mix in organic matter and help, you know, create a better mixing of organic matter as it's developed, as plant roots die and slough off and new ones grow and plant pieces and parts die and they're, you know, incorporated in that soil profile. Then the mold activity may mix that in. So that creates, you know, a more better structured soil profile by doing that. Not saying that that you want molds in your yard, but, you know, let's give them a little bit of credit here. And think about this: every one of these grubs that they eat is not going to turn into a Japanese beetle. It's not going to turn into a June beetle. You know, the Japanese beetles, gosh, they'll feed on 200 odd species of plants, from vegetables to ornamentals, etc. It can cause a fair amount of damage. You know, the June beetles, fruit crops. My gosh, if you're trying to grow peaches, you have a few grapevines. Okay, June beetles, Japanese beetles, they'll get on those things and they like them too. So every one of those grubs that a mole eats is not going to come back and bother you. And also think about this. You know, we have a 13-year periodic cicada. Well, those guys are in the ground right now. They came out the last time in 2011, so they're due to emerge again in 2024. So every one of those cicada grubs or nymphs that they eat right now will not come out to bother you in 2024. Of course, chances are you won't miss them, but there'll be plenty there anyway. But, you know, let's just give them a little credit. Now, we've talked about moles and the kind of damage they cause and so on. What about remedies? Are there things that you can do to help minimize mold damage and to cut down on the potential damage, et cetera, things like that? So home remedies, folks like home remedies because, I don't know, because they're home remedies. You know, they think, well, gosh, it worked for the old folks, maybe it'll work for us. What do you think the number one most commonly suggested or talked about home remedy for mold control that I hear from people? I know Rachel's heard them. Anybody that's worked, you know, in any kind of extension work over the years where they've dealt with homeowners and so on about molds, you'll hear this come up. You know, the number one most commonly suggested home remedy for mold control is juicy fruit gum. I don't know where that came from. Okay, I don't know where that came from. But when we talk about home remedies, you know, this is a listing of some. Chewing gum and why juicy fruit necessarily, I don't know. But castor oil, soaps of different sorts, castor bean plants, hot peppers, whether it's the actual pepper itself or whether it's, you know, the condensed, the capsaicin that's been cooked out of the hot pepper to make capsaicin or hot pepper wax kind of spray. You know, broken glass placed down in the mold runs, razor blades in the mold runs, mothballs down in mold runs, bleach poured down into mold runs. flooding the tunnels with water or with gasoline, etc., things like that. Those are all things that people have used to try to, minimize mold damage, try to encourage moles to go somewhere else and leave them alone. All these things are listed here. From a research standpoint, they just haven't worked. Okay, they haven't worked. That's not to say that somebody, put mothballs down in a mole run and a mole left. All right, but that's anecdotal. And is it consistent? Can you do the same thing that your neighbor did? Your neighbor did what their neighbor did, etc., and always get the same kind of results? Well, that's what research helps us do, is to figure out these things that will consistently work over time. Well, these things have not proven to do that. These different home remedies. And the whole thing about the chewing gum, folks will say, "Oh yeah, the mole will eat that gum and it gums them up inside." Now let's think about this a minute. These things are eating snails. They're eating night crawlers, earthworms, grub worms. I mean, if they can eat a grub worm, you think a piece of juicy fruit is going to slow them down much? I don't think it will. I don't think it will. Now, another thing that will give folks, I guess, pause to believe that a particular home remedy was really successful for them is that, sometimes mold will leave an area when it's disturbed on a continual basis. And, they may leave anyway and come back later. So if a home remedy was used and then, well, I did this and gosh, I went there 3 or 4, 5, 6 weeks and I noticed there's less mold activity. And it could be that, that an individual believes that because of what I did in using this home remedy, the result of that was reduced mold behavior, reduced mold activity. That could be misleading. But there's just not any research out there that shows that the home remedies particularly work very well. Okay. Now, what are some other mold controls? So we predators. Moles they're not, they are predators, but they're not high on the food chain. They're down fairly low in the food chain, I guess. And, there are a lot of predators will get moles. Cats, boy, some cats are excellent molars, just like some are good at catching mice, some are good at catching moles. We watch this cat right here, and I bet that rascal is just waiting to see that earth move, and that cat just going to pounce on there and walk away with that mole, just like this one's doing right here. They were very successful at catching the mole. Some dogs are good at catching moles. Okay, and I've often, I've had conversations with people that would say, "Well, I have a dog, a particular breed or whatnot that does a good job catching moles." And I'm thinking you may have a good livelihood there in front of you by renting your dog out to individuals to catch moles in the yard. But anyway, but predators are, they are a genuine mold control. They can help reduce mold populations. There are store-bought repellents that are marketed to homeowners. Some are noise repellents, like you see this one pictured here. It's allegedly generates these sonic pulses that radiate out through the soil and cause nearby rodents to run for cover. Well, again, a mole is not a rodent. Okay, so that's poor terminology right there. But a mole is not a rodent. And in reality, are moles bothered that much by sound? When you can see mole runs that run along the side of a roadway or beside a driveway, and the traffic traveling up and down those areas, those roads, those drives, etc. I would think that would generate a fair amount of racket, a good bit of vibration in there. And thus far, it has not stopped them from using those kinds of areas. There are repellents that are based on castor oil. Derivative of castor beans. Here's one you see here, Bonide Mole Max, mole and vole repellent. And if you can read the fine print down here under active ingredients, the active ingredient is 10% castor oil. And then the remaining 90% is Fuller's Earth and water. Okay. It's not a real high percentage active ingredient product. It's 10% castor oil is the active ingredient in there. But notice one thing here. The application rate, 1 pound per 500 square feet, a pound per 500 square feet. And that's something I think that folks tend to forget about. We'll talk about that just a little bit more here in a few minutes. But, rates of these things have a big influence. They really impact their efficacy. Are they going to work or not? Because everything has a dose rate. and you've got to put it at a correct dose rate in order to expect to have any kind of success in using those. But this is a low percentage active ingredient, only 10% castor oil. Here's another one. It's a 2.2 pound container. So, you know, if this were the same percentage active ingredient, boy, 2.2 pounds, if you put the pound per thousand, you're covering just a couple of thousand square feet. Or excuse me, you're only covering 1,000 square feet because it's, you know, a pound per thousand, or 500, excuse me, a pound per 500. So with this, you know, this container doesn't go a long way. How much does that container cost? Well, I don't know. But when you think about in a 10,000 square foot lawn, if you're going to use a repellent like this, you're going to treat the whole lawn. You're not going to treat spots, because if it truly does encourage a mold to move away, then they'll move from the treated area to the non-treated area. You know, typically that's what you would expect. So I think that's the reason that people sometimes fail to have the desired success that they would like to have when using some of these products, simply because they don't take into account the application rate or the dose rate, and that has to come into play. Here's another example of a mold repellent. It's castor oil based. This is the spray on it. It's the hose end applicator attached to the water hose and spray it. And the print's so fine. I can't read what the active ingredient percentage is, but you know, the label says here that it will treat up to 8,000 square feet of yard. Okay, I don't know. And then, you know, we've got repellents of different sorts. You know, this one here, it's like a fertilizer spike. You place it down in the mold runs, and it's got some garlic and sulfur and so on in there. To, you know, the idea is that the odor will be repulsive, unpleasant, and the mold will tend to go somewhere else. Okay, how many of those do you have to put in a yard? Okay, in a lawn, to move a couple of molds out of that yard to somewhere else, because it doesn't kill them. Okay, they're sold as a repellent to make an area less hospitable and encourage them to move elsewhere. How many of those is it going to take? That could become an expensive endeavor. You know, here, some ingredients used in one called a Yard Guard mold repellent. It's got some castor oil. You'll see peppers in there very often, oils of different sorts. Got some dolomitic lime, some water, some soap, etc. in there. You know, you wonder sometimes about the effectiveness of those. So from a research standpoint, what has proven to be effective? Well, the noise-making devices just have not proven to be that effective. It encouraging molds to go away, to leave a property, to leave a landscape, to leave a garden. Now, in Michigan, you know, there's a lot of reasons, I guess, that we could be thankful we don't live in Michigan. You know, one is, you know, we live in Tennessee, so that's bound to be better, right? We're here, not in Michigan, but they are blessed to have both star-nosed moles, very active throughout the state of Michigan, as well as the eastern mole. And so they've got a couple of different mole species, and they have yards and landscapes that receive significant damage from molds there. And some of the folks there at Michigan State, you know, the land grant for the state of Michigan, the land grant university have done some research on the effectiveness of some of these products. So back in the, you know, the mid 90s, they studied the effectiveness of a castor oil based mold repellent, but this was a high percentage product, you know, 65% castor oil. And remember, back on some of these we looked at, or one that we looked at, it was only like a 10% product. From that study from 95, you know, they reported some effectiveness with a castor oil product in reducing the number of active surface tunnel. And that's how else you're going to know if a repellent is effective. You see a diminished level of damaged area above ground. You see a reduction. You don't see new tunnels being built. Okay, reduced activity. They did go on to say that the study was limited in duration and the number of testing sites, and they also felt that maybe weather conditions could have influenced the mold behavior. And in essence, they needed, you know, some additional testing to reach definitive conclusions. Now, since that time, I don't know if they published a lot of research on it, but I have recently read some newsletters, if you will, that Michigan State has put out, and you know, they believe that these higher percentage castor oil based repellents can, you know, reduce the amount of activity, mold activity, when applied at the correct rate, because, okay, because apparently it's an odor thing. Moles don't see very well, but they can sense, apparently have a very highly developed sense of smell. And they use that sense of smell to help locate populations of these food sources out there. And the castor oil interferes with that. That's the theory anyway. So it makes it harder to find the food. So they tend to try to go to a place where it's not so hard to find the food. So there can potentially be some benefit from using some of the castor oil based repellents, but typically, at least what they're thinking is that the higher percentage active ingredient products tend to have more efficacy. And regardless of the percentage active ingredient, you need to put it out at the prescribed rate to get the correct dose out there, because that's what the application rate is based on. Other things like toxicants. So here you see an example of a gas product. It puts off a gas. This thing has got some sodium nitrate, some sulfur, some charcoal in there, a smoke bomb, if you will. All right. Then you see an example of this one called mole and gopher bait. Here's another one. Kills moles and gophers, Sweeney's poison peanuts. So this one, the poison peanuts, and the other one back here, the mole and gopher bait, the active ingredient in there is a toxin. Okay, it's called zinc phosphide. It's an old toxin. It's been around a long time, and it'll probably kill mole. It probably will. Now, the smoke bombs, from a research standpoint, they have just not proven all that effective in reducing mole damage, reducing mole populations, etc. But again, the zinc phosphide is probably going to kill moles. It's a pretty good toxin when it comes to killing these small mammals. But the carrier, we go back up here just a little bit. It's called poison peanuts. Well, they're not really peanuts, but it's a grain-based carrier. All right. Moles aren't herbivores. They're not going to eat a lot of plant material. So the likelihood of them consuming a toxin that has been placed onto a grain-based carrier is probably not the best way to get that mole to eat that toxin. Okay, so you may not see a lot of benefit from using a product like that. And anytime you're using a toxin like that, there's always the potential there for causing damage to non-targeted species. Your pets, the cats, the dogs, etc. Because this stuff is going to be placed out here on the ground in the landscape where, your target is apt to come in contact with it, but also non-targeted species can come into contact with it. And, again, if it's going to kill a mole, or if it'll kill a squirrel, it'll cause damage to small pets, to cats, dogs, etc. So that's something that has to be taken into account. So since moles aren't big plant eaters and they're not going to be ingesting lots of plant material, the folks that are making the stuff thought, well, maybe if we could come up with something that kind of more mimics what moles typically like to eat, that might be more effective. So they started creating some different versions. So here's an older product, mole gel bait. And it's like in a caulking tube, okay? Or anybody that's ever flew with livestock, using anthelmintics to worm goats or sheep or whatnot, and it'll be in a tube, like a large syringe like this, kind of a pasty material. So this gel, kind of the idea was, well, it's going to mimic the consistency of a grub or something like that. And they'll use like an anticoagulant, like warfarin, for example, that's common in mouse and rat baits. We go back to the fact that the moles, just because the makeup of their blood, that hemoglobin allows them to live and to process that high carbon dioxide atmosphere. Okay, it's questionable. Do these anticoagulants work as well against them as it does on other species? And again, you still got the potential, of let's say a dog or a cat here digging up into a run or something where somebody placed, a product like this and coming into contact with it and causing some damage to them. So they have progressed over the years, and now they're making mold baits, mold control products that really do mimic the natural food source. These mold worms, if you will, they're made to mimic a night crawler or a grub worm. From a consistency standpoint, from a size standpoint, and they use not necessarily an anticoagulant, but something called an active ingredient. This toxin is bromothylene or bromethylene is the active ingredient, and they've proven to be effective against molds. And they come in different brands, different versions. Here's the Sweeney's brand. They're the ones that made the poison peanuts. This is Matomco mold killer, Sweeney's mold worms, Tomcat mold killer, mimics a natural food source. Can kill molds in one feeding. Here's one, Talprid. Okay, that's a brand that a lot of commercial landscape folks will utilize. This product Talprid is marketed by Bell Laboratories, and folks at Bell Laboratories have put a lot of work into researching molds, and research has shown that they'll eat these things. Moles in captivity, if you will, would consume these worm-like baits. Okay, but just like anything else, there are some professionals, folks that specialize in trapping moles out of landscapes and whatnot. They reported success from using the mold baits and the worm baits, and others said, well, we didn't see quite the same kind of results. Okay, but a real key to success in using any kind of a toxin bait for a mole is where you put it. You got to put it in a place that the mold is likely to come into contact with, and that's the same. That's true for regardless of the species you're trying to control. If you're going to use a bait, you need to put it where the target is apt to come into contact with it. But just like any other bait, you've got the potential to cause damage to non-targeted species. Again, the pets, the cats, dogs, things like that. In every one of these products, these mold baits will have some fairly specific instructions on how to use them. Okay, and you've got to put them in a place where it's most likely that the mold's going to come into contact with it. So this is off the Sweeney's mold worm package, and all the instructions on these kind of baits are very similar. You've got to determine which tunnels are used on a regular basis, which are active. Okay, and so the way to do that, just reading the directions straight off the package right here, make an inch hole in the roof of a tunnel. All right, don't crush the tunnel, just make a hole an inch in diameter. Use a dowel rod or something to poke a hole in there, and then off to the side of the tunnel, you mark that spot. Put a flag, just put something in the ground so you can come back to that place. Come back to it a day, 2 days later, and if that tunnel was repaired, if that hole was patched, where you make the hole, well, there's no longer a hole there. The mold has sealed that back up. Well, that tells you then that, that's a fairly often used tunnel, and that might be a good place for me to place a bait. And so then, following the directions, you pop, again, using a little dowel rod, typically comes with the worms, or in this case, it comes with the worms. You poke a hole there, you wearing gloves, you put the mold worm down into the hole in the tunnel, and you seal it back up, and then go down every 5-10 feet or so along that tunnel doing the same thing. What you do then, because these molds are not going to come up on top of the ground and die, all right? So how do you know it's worked? Well, you go back to those same tunnels, a week or so later, after you have baited them and caused damage, just like you did initially, make a hole in the roof of that tunnel, to see if the mold comes along and repairs it. And if they don't repair it, whereas prior to the placement of the baits they were repairing it, that's a pretty good indicator that, that mold's not bothered me anymore in this tunnel. And if you don't see new tunnels being developed, that's a good indicator that you've had success in minimizing those mold populations. But again, the mold's not going to come up on the surface of the ground to die, so you say, yep, I killed that mold. You're not going to do that. What about reducing the food supply? This is a method that some folks will promote. And so how you do that? Well, you try to kill the insects in the soil where the moles are, or any insect feeding critter, not just a mole, but any insect feeding critter. So things like soil applied insecticides to reduce grubs, for example. And I put here, milky spore with a question mark. Milky spore is a biological, it's an organic product. And it causes a disease in Japanese beetle grubs. And it will keep those grubs from developing and producing adult Japanese beetles. So if you don't have adult Japanese beetles emerge from that grub stage, okay, from that larval stage, then you don't have adults to come out there and reproduce, and you start diminishing the population over time. So folks say, oh, milky spore, that's a good natural biological control. In essence, you inoculate the soil with this organism, and the population of the organism grows, and it infects the grubs that are out there. But it only works against Japanese beetle grubs. So if you don't have a Japanese beetle grub population, then it's of no value against June beetles or mass chafer beetles or against May beetles, etc. So, and that may or may not be a good choice for you. It may or may not. Many insecticides that are going to be applied, you're going to apply them to the soil surface. They're going to have to move down into the soil profile where the insects are, and they're designed to catch on to organic matter, so they're not washed away. So if there's a heavy layer of organic matter near the soil surface, a lot of the active ingredient in the insecticide may never get down into the soil profile where it can come into contact with the insects. So the use of good application practices, we'll talk about those in just a minute, are essential to get it down there to where it's going to do a good job. Now, some of these pesticides, including insecticides, don't have a lot of toxicity to earthworms, and that's good because, do we want to kill all the earthworms? Well, I think not, probably not. But some do have efficacy against earthworms. And for example, carbaryl, we'll talk about it in just a minute, imidacloprid. Both of those insecticides are fairly toxic to earthworms. So they can be used to control grubs, okay? And we don't necessarily want grubs in the yard because they're going to turn into beetles of some sort, and the grubs themselves can cause damage in large numbers just to turf grass and whatnot by feeding on roots. But then the adults come out and they can cause damage, to ornamental plants and the vegetable plants, etc., above the ground. But those same products that will control them, some of those will also have efficacy against desirable insects, like earthworms, night crawlers, and whatnot, and some fungicides. For example, they're used to control diseases in turf grass, like thiophanate methyl. Cleary's 3336 is a brand that uses thiophanate methyl. Well, that particular fungicide can have efficacy against earthworms. So it's hard to say that, I'm going to use this insecticide to kill undesirable insects, but not have damage against, desirable insects such as earthworms. And it's not just grubs, that the moles eat, okay, or these other critters eat. They eat ants, they'll eat slugs, they'll eat centipedes, etc., things like that. A lot of the grub control products may not have efficacy against ants, may not have efficacy against sow bugs and pill bugs and so on. So it's hard to have just one thing that's going to reduce the food supply. But can the food supply be reduced? Yes, it can. But is that going to eliminate a mold problem? Probably not, because you're not going to kill all of the insects out there. You're not going to kill the entire food supply. What it may do is reduce the number of the members of a population it will support. So for example, if you had 2 moles in a yard, now there's only enough food there for 1 mole, potentially. But is it probably going to eliminate the moles? Probably not. But it may reduce the carrying capacity. What about habitat modification? Can you do things to make a place physically less desirable to a mole? Well, yeah. The folks in Michigan have found that, rolling compacts the ground, okay? So these moles create these tunnels, and so the homeowner, they take a weighted roller, they pull behind a lawnmower, or it's got push handle on it, you push it across the yard, you flatten their tunnels back out. Okay, well, tunneling is hard work, and so it could be that you irritate the mole by flattening their tunnel out, and after a while they say, well, the heck with this, I'm going somewhere else. And if that's the case, if you're able to aggravate the mole, kind of like the mole aggravates you, you may take some personal pleasure out of doing that. Just a little bit of satisfaction doing it that way. But yeah, folks have seen over time reduced activity in areas. And by reduced activity, I mean the development of new mole runs, surface tunnels, when the tunnels in an existing area are flattened on a regular basis. They're not allowed to remain, viable. The mole's got to come back and repair them day after day after day. And also, if an area is irrigated, typically you got better plant growth, you'll have more grubs, more earthworms, etc. And because you've got increased soil moisture. So reducing moisture, cutting back on irrigation may reduce the food supply and making the area less attractive. Of course, though, it also may it may cause reduced plant performance. So that's that's something you got to decide on. It's a kind of a path you've got to walk, I guess. Now, one thing though, that every time you take a mole out of a trap, it will never bother you again. A mole trap will not. They are not catch and release traps. They are all kill traps. And mole traps, when used correctly, when used as advertised, when you follow directions, can be very effective at catching mole populations. It's still probably the #1 recommended method for controlling moles. A key to using a mole trap, regardless of the style, there are different styles of traps. This one you see pictured here is kind of a harpoon trap. It's got these spikes on it. It's got a spring-loaded mechanism there. The trap is set, the harpoon is raised, and then when a mole comes along, they trip it, and boom, it impales them with the spears, if you will, the harpoon. Now, there's scissors type traps. There are other versions, okay, of traps. But the key to using them is kind of like using these worm baits. You've got to put them in a place the mole is going to come into contact with the trap. So you've got to identify those active runs. You do it the same way you identify an active run for a bait, by damaging the run and then coming back, in 24 to 48 hours to see if that run has been repaired. If a run has been repaired, then that's a better or a more likely place or a place you're apt to have more success placing a trap there and actually catching the mole. Now, the longer moles are allowed to remain in an area, the harder it is to trap them, simply because they develop more runs. They've got a more complex tunnel system. And again, follow your trap directions. There are some traps that will tell you that you need to excavate a portion of the tunnel and place a trap in inside the tunnel, and then carefully, repair the tunnel, replace the soil over the surface so that it's no longer an open space, etc. Things like that. Take care to keep your scent off of the trap and things like that. This is a guillotine kind of a trap. It works kind of on the same principle as the harpoon trap, but it catches the mole in between, those two horizontal metal surfaces there. And doesn't necessarily decapitate the mole, but it probably breaks its neck, more or less would be, I guess, the way to describe what it does. In my experience, the easier to use ones are those scissors type traps that are installed from the surface. You don't have to excavate the ground. They are designed to be inserted into the soil over the run, and then they use a foot actuated trigger to arm the trap, to set the trap. There's less danger of you pinching your fingers if you let something slip on one of these set traps where you try to set the trap, because the mechanism that's going to do the pinching or catching the mole is under the ground. It's already down there. Now, you can find these lots of different brands, but they kind of follow the same principle. It's a scissors type action. In order for these things to work, okay, the ground has to have a fair amount of moisture in it, because you're going to press down on the surface, okay, on this trigger with your foot and expand those jaws on those scissors, and they're going to have to slice through that soil, okay, in order to reach their set point. And then when the mole trips it, they've got to spring back together and catch the mole in there. So on dry, hard ground, it's going to be hard to set it in there. So it needs to be, if you're going to use traps like this, if the ground has dried out some, that's when you put the sprinklers out there, irrigate that ground a little bit to moisten it back up so that you can set it. Now, where do you set these traps? You don't set them on hills, okay, on mounds, because that's just where the moles have dug deeper out of the ground to move this stuff up to the surface of the ground. You're not going to come into contact with a mole there. The surface runs kind of in straight places, not in real tight turns. are kind of better spots maybe to place those. You can see in this diagram, if you can see my mouse, you know, the arrows, the solid triangular arrows are pointing to places that might be good potential spots in this diagram to set a mole run. If you've identified, or to set a mole trap, if you've identified these are active runs, then these are places within that run that you would consider putting a trap. And, you know, obviously the more traps you have in these runs, the better the chances are that you're going to catch a mole. The better the chances are. And you need to ensure that you orient the jaws of the trap the correct way. You know, they have got to be turned so that as the mole goes through their tunnel and they trigger this thing, then they're going to be caught in between the jaws of these scissors. Do these things work? Yes, they work. Matter of fact, the fellow I worked with today said last week he caught 2 using this very trap right here. This is a high impact plastic trap. Okay. Using this very trap, caught 2 moles in his home yard. The only moles that I have personally ever caught was with a trap like this. You know, again, finding out the best place to put them by identifying an active run is the real key there. And then, you know, don't give up after one time. If you've got one trap in a great big yard, it reduces the probabilities. But again, you've got to identify the more likely place to put these. Okay. So we've talked a lot about moles. They're not the only things out there. Voles are the second choice. And I think this little diagram right here does a good job of explaining the difference between a mole versus a vole. You know, first of all, they don't look the same. Now, folks may confuse them, okay? But, you know, moles over here on the left side got a long snout, got little beady eyes. You don't really see the ears exposed very much. And they have got those very prominent paddle-like front feet and legs made to dig. Voles aren't diggers. Okay, they'll very often use tunnels that other animals have created, such as a vole, or excuse me, a mole is created. Moles are insectivores. Voles are plant feeders. They're herbivores. They're going to eat plant parts. They do most of their damage as far as movement on the surface of the soil. They'll create exposed runs, but they may not be visible because they're in tall grass or overgrown areas, but they do have tunnels, okay, or burrows in the ground where they will live and reside and raise young, etc. But voles eat a lot of plant parts. They'll eat above ground parts, they eat below ground parts, they'll gnaw bark off trees, etc. A vole is more like a mouse than it is a mole. Okay. In Middle Tennessee, we've got 2 species that we're apt to see in our landscapes. You see the pine vole pictured here on the left side of the screen. You know, pine voles overall somewhere 3 to 5.5, 6 inches long. They're not very big. They're not heavy. You know, maybe weigh an ounce or so. Their fur can vary in color, kind of reddish brown. They got little tails. They got little ears, not real prominent, but you can see them. Little eyes sticking out there. They've got the, you know, the mouth, the rodent type mouth. Okay, that allows them to chew and to gnaw on things. They can grasp food particles with their 4 feet, you know, sit on their haunches and eat things. And they do have, you know, little short tails for the most part. They're not super long tails. They can be a reddish brown color, kind of cinnamon color. A lot of variation in fur color. Typically the underside, the bellies and so on are a lighter color than the above side, the upper side, the back sides of them, if you will. And then you've got the other one called the meadow vole. It's a little bit bigger than the pine vole is, where, you know, they're typically about 2 ounces or less, maybe 1.5 to 1.8 ounces, somewhere along there for an adult. They're going to be longer, you know, nearly 6 inches up to nearly 8 inches long sometimes. That includes the length of the tail. They're a darker brown color for the most part, lighter gray or grayish on the bottom side of the underparts, darker on the above, on the back side, the backs and the top portion and so on. And they look more like a mouse. Okay, now they don't have the prominent mouse ears, but compared to a mole, they look more like a mouse. And sometimes folks will see it, oh, that was a field mouse, okay? And they're called that in some parts of the United States, but they are voles, that's what they are, they're rodents. And they're a little different kind of critter altogether. These things, I mean, they're very active, 365 days a year, all day long. Whereas a mole is pretty much fossorial, underground all the time. These are kind of semi-fossorial. Their burrows where they're going to live and have babies and raise babies and so on are underground, but they have a lot of surface runways, okay, and exposed entrances into their burrows, these holes. And these guys, they don't mind being in a pack. You know, there'll be a whole gang of voles out there. A single burrow system can have lots of both adults and young, you know, from different family groups. They don't mind being in a crowd compared to a mole that's more solitary. These things can exist in larger populations. And these are examples of what a vole area looks like. You know, these are surface the entrances to their burrows. You know, these holes on the surface of the ground. And you kind of see here where my arrow is, an exposed runway, you know, that runs between some of these different holes. And you can see like a network. These are runs, okay? They're not truly a tunnel because they're not under the ground, but they're cut into that existing turf. You know, until this stuff was mowed off, you didn't see that, all right? You didn't see that. And because they are very often those runs are covered, then they're not exposed to being preyed upon by predators, okay, like hawks and owls and, you know, things like that, because they're hidden. They can move back and forth in areas because the area is overgrown. You don't see that exposed runway right there because at that point it's not exposed. How you know it's a vole? You know, you see a little round hole there. If it's somewhere in the inch and a half in diameter, that's the size they're going to be. Okay, and then the run, okay, which has been carved into the surface of the plant growth, the material down on top of the ground, going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of an inch and a half, 2 inches wide. You know, you got voles. Okay, that's what you have. Now these things are much more prolific than moles are. They breed year round, mostly in the spring and the summer, and they can have multiple litters throughout the course of a year. And it doesn't take them long to go from a newborn to being a mature female that can reproduce. You know, in 40 days or less, a female can reach the age where she can begin to reproduce. And the gestation period is short, you know, 3 weeks, 21 days, and boom, you can turn a new generation of voles out there. Is there any good news about it? Well, they're not nearly as long lived as moles are. Typically in the 2 to 16 month range is their lifespan. So I guess that's a good thing. But it doesn't take long for a couple of voles to turn into a large population when there's nothing there, you know, to keep them from that. It's not uncommon to have large increases and declines in population, especially based on, you know, food supply. If there's a lot of food, there's a lot of cover that protects voles from natural predators, then their population is going to increase. Okay, just like any other wildlife population would. What do they eat? Well, they're plant eaters. They're herbivores. They don't feed much on insects at all, but they eat grasses. They'll eat the forbs, you know, broadleaf plants, grass plants. They'll eat roots off plants. They'll eat seeds. They'll eat below ground portions like tubers, rhizomes, bulbs, etc. Things like that. In the fall and the wintertime, there's not as much above ground plant parts out there. You don't have the leaves, you don't have the stems and the tender tissues and so on. They'll eat bark. They'll eat roots on the underground portion of plants. And they'll, you know, typically they do that more so in the fall and the winter when the above ground forage is not as available, but they'll eat those parts year round too. You know, they'll gnaw bark off of trees just like a little beaver would. And that can be especially damaging in, say, young fruit orchards. Okay, that's a real problem that folks will have if they set out a few fruit trees, and they don't keep the area around those trees clean and free from vegetation. It makes a good environment for a vole to feed undetected by, you know, natural predators, and so they're not bothered by that. You know, they're small. They make non-uniform bite marks, if you will, at various angles, just kind of irregular. They just gnaw and go at it from all different sides. You know, little bitty little mouths, so they've got bites that are about an 1/8 of an inch wide, 3/8 of an inch long. Not large, not clean. Here's examples of the kind of damage they can do, you know, to small trees. The worst I've ever seen was that they had gnawed them to the point to points, okay, where the plant fell over in a wind. It's kind of like what a beaver would do. but they cause significant amount of damage. But they have pretty much girdled the bark on this little plant right here. Well, you know, if you girdle it entirely, there's a good chance you've killed that plant because you've damaged that vascular tissue. There's damage down here in the lower part. But notice you've got all this grass around here. Okay, so some habitat modification, reducing the amount of cover there can minimize the environment, making it less conducive for voles. Here's they've been on this multi-stem shrub, and they've been gnawing on it. And, you know, they can climb up a little ways, so they can cause damage for the ground leveling up some distance above ground. Here's they've gnawed the gnawed the tops or the side off this carrot. They'll eat roots and rhizomes and bulbs and whatnot. Here's some hostas. Been pulled up, and you can see the gnaw marks right here. Now, you know, back when you get over into the kind of into the Pacific side of the world, you know, they've got a different kind of vole over there that can cause some really significant damage on some of these large trees, and that's called, you know, a DBV, or a dang big vole. No, wait. Excuse me, my mistake. That damage was caused by a dang big chainsaw. So we're not going to have to worry about that so much. But the point is, voles are going to cause damage to plants, whereas moles don't necessarily cause that kind of damage. Moles cause disruption, etc., but voles will damage your plants. They potentially can. So how do you know if it's a vole out there? You know, you look for the signs of voles. You know, gnawing damage above ground on plants, or examine roots to see if there's been feeding activity. But also, you know, you're going to have those burrow openings, those round holes, inch and a half diameter holes, and then runways in between the holes and the feeding areas. Populations are going to go up when you've got good food source for them. You've got good cover, that they're not going to be where they can hide from predators, you know, natural predators or owls and hawks and snakes and things like that, but cats and dogs too. I mean, they can catch them, but typically predators by themselves are not enough to control that population. Can you exclude them? Yeah, their barriers can be erected, you know, to deny access to these voles from plantings. They're going to have to extend. It'd be a solid, for example, a metal barrier has to extend down below the soil surface 6 inches or so. They're not super diggers, so they're not going to dig down very deeply. But you know, that can become expensive for larger areas. It can be time consuming. It's probably more feasible on a smaller scale. Habitat modification, reducing the amount of vegetation, having kind of clear, no plant zones growing up around desirable plants can help to create an environment not as conducive for voles to come and feed and cause damage on those ornamental plants. Other controls, you know, frightening agents, typically not very effective against them. Repellent products, you know, they're not out there eating insects. It's questionable whether the scent products like the castor oil and so on are that effective. Capsaicin-based or pepper-based products, because these critters do eat plant parts. You know, hot pepper wax spray, etc., has concentrated capsaicin, which is the substance in hot peppers that gives it the heat. That's a product that can be applied to the surface of plants. And then when they come along and they bite that, or they try to feed on it, you know, it can light them up. It can cause, you know, physical pain because of the heat of the capsaicin. You know, it's concentrated capsaicin. It's not going to be long-term protection. It degrades in the atmosphere. It can be washed off under heavy rainfall, etc. Trapping is another option. Now, it can be a fairly laborious process, and you know, if you're going to trap a large area, the cost can become a significant feature, I guess, because you got to have the traps, you got to have the time to go out and put the traps out and debate them. What kind of traps are we talking about? It doesn't take anything special. You know, you can use the snap traps just like you would use, you know, for mice or for rats, and they are plant feeders. Peanut butter with oats, etc., mixed together can be a pretty good bait. But the thing is, they like to feed undercover because they are, you know, a prey animal for some of your higher level predators like hawks and owls and, you know, cats and dogs and things like that. So the stations, the trap stations need to be undercover. And here are a few pictures that illustrate that. You know, this is, you know, you typically would place traps near burrow openings. And it's not a bad idea to place one on either side of the opening. and then cover it with something. You know, here they used a piece of just a plastic gutter and punched holes in the gutter. It'll sit right down over there, and used landscape fabric staples to hold it in place. That gives that cover that these critters like to feed under, so they feel protected, they feel safe because they're feeding under cover. You know, here's another example of aluminum gutter. Again, it's got the holes punched through it here, and you can see a trap on this end, there's a trap on the other end, and that's to hold it in place so the wind won't blow it away. You can see here's an example using the gutters again, and they're using again landscape fabric staples across there to hold those things in place. You can use a large flower pot, you can use a wash tub, you know, large buckets, containers like that, where you can place the traps, okay, near the holes, you know, bait the traps, and then cover them with a cover of some sort, and then weight the cover so that it's not going to blow away. For these little snap traps, you know, you might be better served to just drill a small hole in here, like a 1/4 inch diameter hole, and use a large nail stuck through there to kind of hold that trap in place. All right, nothing wrong with that. And folks seem to have better luck if they can place a trap on either side of a hole, not just the one like that. You can maybe determine if an area is still being actively used by, you know, taking some fresh fruit. Like here's an example of a pear slice that was placed, you know, under a cover out here because they are plant feeders. They'll feed on vegetation, and you place it out there, leave it for 24 hours or so, and then come back and check it. If you got signs of fresh feeding activity, then that tells you that you still got an active population, and it's probably worth your while to maybe try to trap, you know, in a place like that. It makes good sense to put a trap there. What about baits, poison baits? You know, there are bait stations that are marketed for vole control. Here's an example of one. You know, it's a commercially prepared station. They are covered stations, okay, because first of all, voles like to feed under cover. They feel safer, but also they typically are going to use an anticoagulant kind of bait, like are used for rats, for mice. I don't know that any of them are labeled just for voles only. Okay, but these anticoagulants do work against voles, but they also can have efficacy or cause damage to cats and dogs, etc., things like that. So that's why you need to place them in a covered station to deny access to non-targeted species. It also just increase the likelihood that the voles are going to come in there and feed on this stuff because it is in a protected feeding space for them. You know, the zinc phosphide baits like we saw earlier, the poison peanuts, etc. You know, those baits are going to be toxic to voles, but they're not labeled for vole use. Okay, they're not labeled for vole use, and technically using a product to control a pest that product is not labeled to control is a violation. So, you know, I would not suggest to you that you ought to use non-labeled products out there for voles. Okay, if it's not named on the label for using against voles, then I suggest you don't use that. But again, always use those baits because you are talking about a poison in a covered station to restrict access to those non-targeted species like pets. Predators, again, you know, if you can do things to encourage a predator to start maintaining, you know, a presence around the property, that can. Sometimes they'll catch the voles like that. But I have heard of instances where folks did encourage a hawk to take up residence. And after the vole population had been decimated, neighbors started missing small pets. And you know what? You're not going to go out and shoot a hawk to make it go away. So I don't know that encouraging, simply because it's illegal to do that. And are you going to do that right downtown anyway? Nope, probably not. It's probably a bad idea to try to encourage in a residential setting, to try to encourage predatory animals to take up residence. I mean, this has happened right here in Murfreesboro a few years ago. Individuals had encouraged a hawk to take up residence there, and they'd done a good job of catching some mice and some voles, etc. And then a couple of neighbor pets turned up missing, and they're wondering what they can do, you know, to get rid of the hawk. And now they've created a problem. So I'd encourage you not to do that. All right, so we talked a lot about mold, we talked a lot about voles. What about some of these other things? You know, maybe that we don't the first thing think about causing, you know, the kind of damage that we see when we say something's been tearing up areas in my yard. Well, just the old common striped skunk, and we have a healthy skunk population here in Rutherford County. It's one of the, you know, for years has been a primary carrier of rabies in the county. I mean, skunks, they're a good rabies carrier. Okay, they are. And they're prevalent, very prevalent. Now, what kind of holes do they dig? You know, typically a smaller animal makes a smaller hole, larger animal makes a larger hole. So they are insect feeders, and they'll feed, you know, on lizards and things like that, but also grubs and worms and snails and slugs, etc., things like that. And they've got a good sense of smell, and they use that sense of smell to locate, you know, good areas out there that where there's a pretty good food supply, and they're going to dig down shallow holes. You know, typically holes that are made by skunks in the 1.5 to 3 inch diameter range. Again, they don't always read the books, and they might make a hole bigger than that. But typically they're going to be in that range, 1.5 to 3 inches in diameter, relatively shallow, and they're kind of cone shaped. They're wider at the top, they're narrow out down at the bottom. And you may see soil piled up around the edges from where they've been digging. You know, here's some in some pretty dense grass, you know, to give you an idea. Here's a golf ball. Well, these were made by skunks, okay? And they have dug through the grass and gone down in there, you know, look at that good lush grass growth. So you got a lot of roots down there. That's a good environment for grubs to be living in. And so, you know, it can be a good place for these guys to go dine on. You know, here's an example. They pull some grass up around the edge of the hole where they've dug down there to gather some of these insects down in the ground. Raccoons, you know, bigger animal, you expect a little bigger kind of damage, and they're probably more vigorous diggers than a skunk would be. And you know, too, you can always tell if it's a skunk when you go out and see the damage and you smell the skunk, they've been there. Unless the COVID's taking your sense of smell away, that's a real good indicator that this damage was caused by a skunk. But just the size of the hole can be a good indicator also. But it's not uncommon for a raccoon, you know, they're going to feed on the same kind of stuff. They'll eat the grub worms and other insects and whatnot, as well as other food sources, okay? But they're going to dig bigger areas, and it's not uncommon for them to reach in there with those 4 feet and pull back like they're trying to peel back sod or peel back turf covering to expose grubs, kind of like what you've seen pictured here, where they've kind of peeled it back versus digging, just digging a hole down. And I've seen images of areas that had high grub populations where near a wood line, like on the athletic field, and had a good wood line there, you know, provide some shade and whatnot in the natural area. And these things do most of their feeding at night. And they would come out in the evening and, my gosh, just decimate an area. When you had multiple skunks out there and you had multiple raccoons, they could just really dig and damage a lot of area like that. And then the armadillo, you know, those things have come here. They're prolific diggers. They're very good diggers. And they've got a bigger head, and you would expect them to make a bigger hole than you're going to anticipate seeing from a skunk, for example. And typically those holes are going to be, you know, 6 inches deep or less, maybe 4 inches or so in diameter. I mean, the deeper they go, typically the wider the hole is going to be. And but it's going to be bigger than a skunk hole, okay, and probably not have the sod or the turf pull back or rip back like you would see with a raccoon or something like that digging after it. You know, these again, that they do the most of their feeding. You know, they're nocturnal. They're going to feed more in the evening time frame than they are out in the middle of the day. Although in the cooler months of the year, they may be more active on a warm, sunny day during cold weather than they would be on a cold, frigid night. So that might be a time that you would see, you know, a change in their feeding pattern. But they can cause a fair amount of damage. You know, here's an example of armadillo damage in my yard. They've dug that hole there. You know, that thing's about 4 inches across. It's about 5 inches or so deep. And they're just scattered at random, no kind of pattern to them in an area. This was under some trees. Pretty good moisture environment down there, could support a pretty good population of insects for these things to come and feed on. And you get enough out there that are feeding, they don't mind being together. You know, it's not uncommon to see multiples in one place. It's not You won't always see that, but it's not uncommon for that to happen. And on a good food, on an area that's got a good food source, they can go to town and damage an area pretty bad. And that's about as worst I've ever seen. An example like that. So what are some control options for these surface feeders, like the voles, and the skunks, and the raccoons, and the armadillos? Now, this is a case where reducing food supplies, especially grubs, can be an option for you. But again, you got to do some things the right way. First of all, the correct dose. Okay, any kind of a soil applied insecticide or any kind of a soil applied product, whether it's a castor oil based repellent or some other active ingredient based repellent, is going to have directions on how much to put out there per unit of area. Whether it's a pound per 1,000 feet or 3 ounces per 500 feet, etc. So you have to put the correct dose out there in order for it to be effective. And also it has to go out at the correct time. Most of these grub control products especially are marketed to work either as a preventative or as a curative. And a preventative product is one that's not going to have any efficacy against the grub population that's there now. For example, a preventative product, they're going to use active ingredients such as, this imidacloprid, a brand name, BioAdvanced Season-Long Grub Control. All right. The time to apply that is kind of in the, spring to early summer time frame, late spring, early summer time frame. It's not going to have any efficacy against a grub population that's there now. What it's going to do is have efficacy against the new grub population. For example, if you applied it in June of 2021, you're trying to impact the 2022 grub population, because it works against newly hatched, young, actively growing grubs. What has to happen is these grubs have got to go through, their life cycle. They've got to pupate. They've got to turn into adult beetles. They come out of the ground. They fly around. They feed. They mate. They reproduce. They lay the eggs. Eggs hatch and the little grubs fall into the ground, and they start tunneling down there and start doing their thing to keep the cycle going. So these preventative insecticides need to be in place prior to those young ones becoming older and well established, because that's where they have their efficacy against those young ones. So that's why they're called preventative. There's another one you see listed out here, the Scott's GrubX. It's a granular product. The active ingredient, man, that's chloron tranil, I can't pronounce it, a big old long name. Okay, this insecticide active ingredient, but a brand name is Scott's GrubX. It's a granular product that you apply over the surface of the ground. You apply it in the April to May time frame, but again, it doesn't move through the soil very rapidly, so you can put it out a bit earlier. But then you've also got some that are classified as curative kind of products. These are used to control grubs that are there now, the more mature grubs. But in the spring of the year, if you wait, you've got to put these curative products out before May 15th, because by the middle of May, most of these grubs have stopped any feeding, okay, and they have started to pupate to finish their life cycle and turn into adults. So it's not going to be effective on them once they start to pupate. So you've got to get the product out there, these curative kind of products, before May the 15th, in the spring time frame. Examples: active ingredient Carbaryl. It's a very old product. 7 lawn insect granules is an example of Carbaryl, active ingredient Carbaryl. They're applied in that September, October time frame. Trichlorophone is another one. A brand name, BioAdvanced 24-hour Grub Killer Plus. And don't let that 24-hour Grub Killer fool you. It's not going to kill the grubs in 24 hours. It's going to take longer than that. But it will kill existing populations. Okay, it will kill more mature grubs. But again, you've got to put it out there. If you're going to do it in the springtime, April, early May, before the May 15th time period comes, when those grubs start to pupate into their adult phase. And then again, kind of like the Carbaryl, in that September, October time, the early fall time period. Regardless of the kind of insecticide you use, it's going to take, roughly 1/2 inches of irrigation or rainfall after applying to move that insecticide down into the soil where the insects are. It needs to get down there where they are to come into contact with them for it to do any good. The more organic matter there is on the surface of the soil, the more of that insecticide will be bound to that organic matter and not move in there. So dethatching a lawn area prior to application may improve efficacy. You may improve, the level of control that you get. Also, if it's dry, if the soil is, if you're in a dry spell, it could be to your advantage if you're going to use a soil insecticide like this to irrigate the area a couple of days prior to application to increase the moisture levels, to encourage those insects to come closer to the surface, so that insecticide does not have to go down there quite so as deep in order to reach the insects and to have a better chance of controlling them. So, good application techniques. You put the right dose out there. You've got to know how big the area is that you're going to treat. So, I mean, if you don't have a clue, you're just guessing, then you're just kind of throwing money away. You're wasting your time, you're wasting your resources. You need to know how big the area is, and you need to put the correct dose out there and then follow those directions. It needs to be irrigated into that soil surface after applying it. And some grub products are not going to kill ants, okay? They're not going to kill some other insects. So it's hard to have just a product that's going to kill all of the potential food sources out there. But we tend to kind of suggest that you target grubs, because grubs can also have damage, on the turf grasses. If you have a heavy grub population, they can cause damage to roots and of turf grasses and other plant material too. So that's why it's not a bad idea to target grubs. And plus, those grubs, they're going to turn into beetles that come out of the ground, like Japanese beetles, etc. They can cause damage to plants as an adult. So those use good practices, and if you're going to use an insecticide to cut down on surface feeding, you might want to use products that tend to target the grub worms, versus trying to kill the ants, etc. Just to reduce damage from skunk and armadillo and raccoon feeding, things like that. What about trapping? Sure, trapping is an option, but what are you going to do if you're successful? What if you catch one? What are you going to do with it? I mean, are you going to take it and turn it loose somewhere else? Well, by law, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to move animals from place to place. So what are you going to do? If you catch a skunk, there's not a season on skunk. You can shoot a skunk. If you catch an armadillo in a trap, you can shoot that armadillo and dispose of it. Have it a nice burial and put it to rest with dignity, I guess. But I mean, how many folks want to do that? So, you want to think about that. And if trapping is something you're considering, you might consider using a professional wildlife service where folks will trap. They will trap animals and take them away. They're licensed to do that. Castor oil-based repellents, because they do, work. They have an odor aspect to them, may reduce feeding damage in a given area for a short period of time, but you don't expect it to be a long-term kind of thing. We're talking live traps here, not like a mold trap where it's a kill trap. We're talking live traps. Armadillos. Here's an example of an armadillo trapping setup. You don't have to have bait to catch armadillos, trap armadillos. Here's one in this trap here. You see kind of blurry picture. But the idea with using these kind of live traps for armadillos is you want to create kind of a funnel system to encourage. The armadillos don't have good eyesight. They got a keen sense of smell, and they tend to follow along a border or follow along an edge. Okay, if they I'm following along this wall here, I'm going to keep going, and it funnels them right into the trap. You can exit or you can enter this trap on two directions. So they got these 2x boards set out there to encourage the critter to move towards the trap. Here's another example. They set the trap up alongside a wall, and they've got just a piece, some construction fencing got staked in place to encourage. Okay, you've got the wall over here. So if this thing moves down the wall, if it moves down the fence, and boom, there it is. He's encouraged to move towards the trap opening. Now, you can bait. It's not absolutely necessary. Oklahoma State folks, they recommend you don't have to bait the trap. You try to funnel them into it. But they do suggest that you might have better luck if you set your trap out there. Again, it takes a fairly big trap. They suggest a 12 by 12 by 32 inch trap. Those that are designed for skunks may be a bit small to catch a full grown armadillo. But they suggest maybe you take some fresh loose soil to put over the floor of the trap once you get it set where you want it, to make it a little more inviting to the armadillo. Apparently they like the soft surface and don't want to walk on the the metal cross pieces and framework that make up the trap. It might encourage a little more success or enhance your potential success by using a trap like that. If you do want to bait it, you can. University of Florida's got a publication where they suggest that good bait for armadillo trap would be worms, red wigglers, crickets, things like that can be good bait sources. Again, they've got a pretty good sense of smell, but that bait's not going to last forever. So if you have it out there overnight and you don't catch anything, you're probably looking to have to change it again, the next time. For skunks, if you want to use live traps to catch a skunk, cat food is not a bad option as far as a bait. Visit with some folks at local animal control, and that's what they would use to catch skunks. They would use cat food. Raccoons, things like sardines can also be a good bait in order to lure a raccoon into a trap like that. Okay, moving along here, crawfish. That's one we don't see near as much or get near as many complaints from individuals in their home lawns that are causing damage, but they're here. And there are places in Rutherford County, in the city of Murfreesboro, where it's not uncommon to have damage in the lawn from crawfish. And a crawfish, it's just like what's crawfish you're going to find in a creek. You're going to find them in areas where there's a high water table. The ground tends to stay wet for a long period of time. Folks used to have a term for it, that ground was crawfishy. It doesn't dry out, it wants to stay wet for a long period of time. And what damage do they do? Well, the damage is this: they create these mounds, little volcano-like mounds, and you look at the color of that dirt they pulled out of there. On good oxygenated soil, you're going to have a redder color, maybe if it's high organic matter soil, a black color. But on these sites that are conducive to have crawfish, you're going to have soil color that indicates to you that it stays waterlogged for a period of time. You don't have a lot of oxygen content in there. Like this mound right here, it's kind of got a little bit of a yellow cast to it. Or this is a very common color. This is what I tend to see more, here in the city and in the county. It's kind of grayish color. That's indicative that soil has stayed waterlogged for a long period of time. It's got a low oxygen content, so that any iron present in the soil doesn't oxidize and give it that nice red color. Again, the damage. They're not really feeding on the plant material. They're not causing, they're not consuming stuff, but they're creating these mounds out here. And then you mow across them, and you're hitting them with lawnmower blades, etc. And they can become fairly populated. You can have several mounds in a wet place or in a home lawn environment that has soil that favors a crawfish, high water table. Is there? Because you've got a high water table, it's probably not a good idea to use a toxin on these, because it's going to wind up, that toxin wind up down in water somewhere, okay, in groundwater. So that's probably not a good idea. In reality, if you've got a crawfish issue, a problem, then you're probably looking at the best way to deal with it is to modify that habitat, to put in some sort of a drain system that is going to help dry that ground out faster, so that it does not hold water for as long a period of time, and helps that groundwater move away quicker, and just creates a less favorable environment. But as far as a toxin that you're going to use out there, repellent, boy, there's nothing that's really proven to be super effective in that regard. Now, fortunately, this is not an issue that the bulk of people are going to have, but the folks that do have it, it can be, it can be an irritation to them. It can be a real irritation to them. Now, what are other things that can cause damage? You know, tear up your yard in places. Squirrels. I mean, they'll dig small holes and they'll bury, you know, food. So they'll bury nuts and etc. Things like that. They'll get into flower beds and bury walnuts, bury hickory nuts, etc. They'll get into a lawn area, do the same kind of thing. And you know, if the squirrel population at your house is anything like it is at mine, I don't have a shortage of squirrels. And when those things get out there, you get to burying stuff, they can cause some damage, surface damage. Chipmunks, you know, ground squirrels, chipmunks, they can dig burrows, create some damage. But you know, we don't see that nearly as much as we see with the moles and the voles and the skunks and things like that. You know, groundhogs, sure they can, and those are vegetation eaters. They can get in under homes or under a building, you know, shop buildings, outdoor storage barns, etc., things like that. You know, wild hogs. It's probably not an issue in towns and whatnot, but in fields, especially in some areas in West Tennessee and up on the Cumberland Plateau, I mean, they can cause a lot of damage just by rooting and wallowing, making wallows out in the field, just damaging spaces like that. So yeah, they can certainly be a nuisance. It can cause damage. You know, in things, other things that can cause holes in the ground. You know, cicada killer wasps. Especially in flower beds, landscape beds where the ground's good and soft. You know, these are solitary wasps. They can be 1.5 inches, 2 inches long, big yellow, black looking wasp, and they look scary because they're big. And they're a solitary ground nesting wasp. They're going to make a hole, you know, a good 3/4 of an inch in diameter. And a person gets that working in a flower bed, pulling weeds or whatnot, they can be flying around in their face. You know, I've never known anyone to get stung by one. The females can sting, but you would just about have to grab it in your hand and squeeze it to make it sting you. But you know, there are insects that will create holes out here in the ground. Ground nesting bees and wasps are examples. Night crawlers will create mounds, raised little mounds with a hole right in the center out there. When I say little mounds, you know, you're talking maybe 1 inch, 2 inches tall, a little volcano-shaped mound with a perfectly round hole right in the center of it. So those are all kinds of things that can, you know, additional things that can cause some physical damage, or at least you see evidence that something's been working out there in a yard, and cause, you know, just evidence that I've been there and I've caused some damage. One thing I'll point out as we get near the end of this, you know, you can catch or kill every mole and vole on a given piece of property. And more can move in from next door before the day's over with because they are very mobile. Okay, they're very mobile. Skunk can wander in overnight, you know, groundhogs, the raccoons, etc. It's not something that, oh shoot, I've trapped these moles, I'll never be bothered with them again. That's just not going to happen. Okay, that's just not going to happen. If you have questions about anything we cover here this evening, or other things pertaining to your lawns, landscapes, gardens, etc., you can reach us here at the Extension Service Office. The number's posted right there, 898-7710. That's my email address, but my coworker, Rachel Painter, she's on here tonight. She's been monitoring the chat. We're fixing to get into, see if we can answer any questions that folks may have asked during the course of this presentation. You know, our County Director, Anthony Tuggle, he's available. You can reach us all here at this same number. I do have, if I can do this, I have a poll here, and it's got 3 questions on the poll. And if you would, you know, just take, I'm going to launch this poll right now. And if you would just answer those questions, I'm going to give you just a, you know, just a little bit of time to answer those 3 questions. I'm going to let it run for just a few minutes, not a few minutes, but just a few seconds here, and give you a chance to answer that. I'd appreciate any feedback that you could give by answering that. And then we'll look at the chat box, see if we have any questions from folks out here in the audience. So I'm gonna let this run for, I don't know, 30, 45 seconds or so. Folks have a chance to, if you would, just, you know, it's strictly anonymous. I don't know who's answering, how you're answering, anything like that. I'm gonna let this run on here just a few more minutes. And Rachel, do we have questions in the chat box?
We do. From
Okay.
Joseph Rolway. Will moles tunnel under a non-mortared brick patio?
Will a tunnel under a non-mortar brick patio? Was that the question?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they could. Now, I don't know that that would necessarily be their first choice, but they could. That is a possibility. That now, it might be more likely to find a deeper tunnel under that patio, simply because you've got the brick on there, you've got the additional weight of the brick that they've got to push up against to create that tunnel near the surface. But yes, they could. Yes, they certainly could.
This one from Dorothy just popped in. Is 7 effective in the spring, early May, like now?
Yeah, 7. It can be effective against grubs in the ground right now. It typically becomes less effective when those grubs they start to enter that pupation phase of their life cycle, where they're going to start turning into adults and they're not active anymore. So now it should still be good. And I'm gonna add in this polling. It's been running for a couple of minutes, and it looks like a lot of folks have answered that. So appreciate that. All right, other questions, Rachel? And I'm gonna stop sharing the screen.
Are moles most active early morning or any hours in the morning?
Yeah, I mean early morning. And what is early? They don't need daylight, so that's not something that they're going to. That's not going to be an issue for them. Especially in the hotter months of the year, they're going to be more active. Typically in the early hours, because the soil is cooler, closer to the surface of the ground. But I mean, there can be instances, especially in shady places, where you got good moisture, that they may be active up into the day, not necessarily just so much in the morning. But as a rule, they're more active in the morning hours, earlier in the morning. 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, up until late morning time frame. But again, it seems like sometimes they don't always read the right books, and they don't do what they're supposed to do.
I believe that's it for the questions. If you all ever do have any other questions, feel free to email either of us, of course, or before you get off of here, you can put in the chat your email address so we can reach out to you.
Yeah. So again, appreciate you signing on and spending this time. I see a question down there. What do chipmunks eat? Chipmunks, they're vegetation eaters, plant parts, roots, seeds, foliage, things like that. I guess, they're more, they are a rodent, much like a vole is, or much like a squirrel is. So you're going to be having similar kinds of diets. I know someone typed in that maybe the best thing is to learn to live with moles. They're here for a reason, I guess. They are here. They do what they're intended to do, and sometimes that interferes with maybe our preferences. But we're not going to eradicate moles, I don't think. But you can minimize. Potential damage and cut down on increased damage. Anything else, anybody? Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, no other comments, then folks, appreciate you being here. Hope you found something useful out of this. And, we'll, if you don't already get our newsletter, I think Rachel may have put that in the chat box there. The newsletter that goes out on a monthly basis is a good way to stay abreast of, upcoming presentations, upcoming topics, and so on. So again, like Rachel said, if you have questions in the future, you know how to get in touch with us via email, via telephone. So give us a shout, and we'll do our best to assist you with maybe troubleshooting some of these things, these problems that you run into out there. And a question down here from Dorothy Murphy: is MoleMax a waste of money? Is it a waste of money? Well, if you don't put it out at the correct rate, yes, it would be a waste. It would be. on any kind of a product, any kind of a pest control product, here we're talking about repellent, it needs to go out at the recommended rate. If that rate is, you know, a pound per 500 feet, and you go out there and you put a half pound per 500 feet, well, then you just wasted it. You know, you just wasted it. The research that I've seen shows better results from using the higher percentage of castor oil in that, which is the active ingredient. The higher the percentage of active ingredient would be typically leads to better results. So that's the best way I know to answer that question. And there's some folks, you know, use products like that, and they will tell you, oh, I think it worked great for me. And other folks will use similar products, and they'll say, well, you know, I couldn't tell it all that much. Question here, where do crawfish come from? They are, you know, they are crustaceans that typically do their feeding in water, but they do spend some time above ground, and that's you know, they're like kind of like frogs, I guess, in that respect. They can spend time underwater, but they need to be on the surface, out of the water. So high moisture environments where you have a high water table, and they feed on, you know, insects and things, just like like skunks and armadillos, things like that. But, you know, they typically find the bulk of their food supply in, you know, in that aquatic environment, you know, water insects, stream insects. But I mean, when they come up out of there and build those, build their little volcanoes, their mounds, crawfish mounds, that so that they can come out and they've got to breathe some atmosphere. They got to have some they got to breathe some air. Okay, so that gives them a chance to get out of the water and to get the oxygen. But they're there because of that high water table. And there are places, you know, over around the Leaf Avenue area here in Murfreesboro. There's some yards over there that, especially early in springtime, this time of the year, you can walk across the ground and it's just squishy wet, just really high water table, and you'll see crawfish mounds. That old dark gray dirt indicates that the ground stay waterlogged. It doesn't have any oxygen in there because it does stay waterlogged for so long. They don't really hurt anything as far as the plants are concerned, but I mean, it's unsightly. You create these mounds out there, and you know, we got a fair amount of clay content in our soil, and that clay dries out, it gets hard, and you start banging over those with lawnmowers, it'll dull those mower blades pretty fast, and you know, you're slinging dirt clods around and whatnot, and you throw one through a window or something, and boy, that's just a really great way to end the day right there. So that's the kind of issue you run into with the crawfish. And I mean, sometimes it's not an easy fix. Trying to install a drainage system of some sort can be expensive to help pull that groundwater away and move it out of there faster. So I don't have a good answer for you in terms of, you know, the crawfish part of it. All right. Have we covered everything, Rachel?
I think so, surely.
Okay. Well, that being the case, then we're going to close this thing. And again, you know where to reach us. Appreciate you taking this time out of your lifetime. You'll never get back. And boy, you spend it here with us. So we appreciate that and hope you found something of value and you'll join us again sometime in the future. That being the case, so long, folks, and we will talk to you hopefully down the line. Have a great evening.